Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling China's economic slowdown.
Yeah, and we're not just skimming the surface here,
Nope. We're going deep.
using The State Strikes Back as our guide.
It's by Lardy.
It really challenges some common assumptions about China's economy and why it's not.
Yeah, why it's not like booming like it used to.
Yeah, exactly.
So to kick things off, I think everyone remembers,
Oh, yeah.
China had those crazy double-digit growth years.
Absolutely, for decades.
But things have cooled down, especially since
the global financial crisis, for sure.
Lardy's argument is that there's this, kind of a hidden factor at play.
And a lot of people might find it pretty surprising.
For sure.
He's pointing to the rise of, state-owned enterprises, SOEs,
Right.
and how they're affecting China's efficiency and growth.
Yeah, it's a fascinating argument.
I mean, think about it this way.
Yeah.
You're pouring resources into these massive companies, expecting them to, drive the economy.
Right. Yeah.
But they're not getting the results you'd expect.
Yeah.
It's like,
A leaky bucket.
exactly, a leaky bucket.
Keep pouring it in, but it never fills up.
Yeah, never quite gets there.
Okay, so to really get into this,
Uh-huh.
we need to set the scene a bit, go back in time.
Okay.
I mean, China had phenomenal growth,
Oh, it was huge.
averaging something like 12% growth.
Yeah, between 2005 and 2008.
Oh.
Incredible expansion, really.
And that lifted so many people out of poverty.
Absolutely. Millions.
But then, after '08, after the financial crisis,
Things started changing, yeah.
growth slowed down.
Between 2015 and 2016, the average was...
Under 7%, right.
Under 7%, yeah.
And usually people point to,
Oh, the usual suspects.
the global slowdown,
Yeah, global trade slowing down,
China's population getting older,
the demographics shifting
and having to shift away from that.
from an investment and export-led growth model.
Right, exactly.
But Lardy's saying we need to look deeper. There's more to it.
And that's where things get really interesting, because he
Mhm.
says even before the crisis, there were some red flags,
Hidden in plain sight, almost.
like in China's success story.
Like their huge trade surplus.
Right.
It was actually contributing to unsustainable growth.
Oh.
Well, think of it like overinflating a tire.
Okay, I get you.
Looks impressive,
Right.
but it's,
Ready to burst.
yeah, much more likely to burst.
So what caused this overinflation?
Well, China's currency was undervalued at the time,
Uh-huh.
and there was this big gap between their savings and investments.
So it's kind of like an artificial boost?
Yeah, it couldn't last forever.
So are you saying that part of the slowdown was actually a good thing?
In a way, yeah.
Like a correction?
It was needed for sustainable growth,
Interesting.
but it did contribute to the lower overall growth.
Okay, so that's one piece of the puzzle, the trade surplus, and
Okay.
how it had to be corrected.
Right.
But now let's talk about those SOEs.
The state-owned enterprises, yeah.
They're a big part of Lardy's argument, right?
Absolutely front and center.
He's saying that their resurgence and the fact that they're underperforming is a big reason for the slowdown.
A major contributor, yeah.
And he has some pretty convincing evidence.
He does.
Like, after the financial crisis, what happened to their returns on assets?
They plummeted.
Like, how much?
For industrial SOEs, we're talking a 2/3 decline.
Wow, that's massive.
And for the service sector SOEs, it was a 2/5 decline.
No.
Meanwhile, private firms were doing just fine.
Yeah, showing higher returns. And what's really striking is just how big these SOEs are.
Oh, yeah.
They control so much.
Huge amounts of assets,
Yeah.
and it keeps growing.
Lardy actually calculated that if SOEs were as efficient as private firms back in 2015, China's GDP would have been
13 to 15% higher.
That's a lot of potential growth.
Just left on the table.
So it raises the question, why are these SOEs underperforming?
Big question.
And what can be done about it?
Yeah, what can be done?
But before we get into that,
Okay.
there's this common argument we need to address,
What's that?
that SOEs are weighed down by all these social responsibilities,
Oh, yeah.
providing housing and healthcare, pensions.
Right.
But Lardy actually addresses that head on.
He knows.
He points out that those burdens have actually eased up a lot.
Over the past couple of decades, yeah.
So that explanation doesn't really hold water.
Not really? No.
So if it's not that, then what is it?
Well, Lardy argues that there are two big problems at play here.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, many SOEs just aren't focused on maximizing profits.
Interesting. So they're not prioritizing efficiency?
Not always, no.
What are they prioritizing then?
They often prioritize size and political influence.
Ah, so it's not always about what makes good business sense.
Sometimes it's about what serves political agendas.
That makes sense.
But that's only part of the story.
Okay, there's more.
There's another issue that's a bit more complex.
Okay, lay it on me.
It's called capital misallocation.
Capital misallocation.
It's basically when loans are given to companies based on
On what?
political connections, not their ability to actually repay.
Oh, wow.
And that's a big problem in China with these SOEs.
So it's distorting the market.
Yeah, and it's hurting economic efficiency.
Lardy actually uses a great example to illustrate this.
Oh, yeah. Which one?
The thermal power industry.
Right, I remember that.
Even though demand was falling,
Mm-hmm.
there was all this investment in building new power plants.
Yeah, why was that?
Because of political incentives and a lack of real competition.
It's a classic case of how distorted incentives can lead to...
Wasted resources.
Exactly. And ultimately slower growth.
It's not like the Chinese government hasn't tried to fix this, though.
No, they've tried all sorts of reforms. The results haven't been great.
So not for lack of trying.
No, not at all.
Sounds like we've got a lot more to unpack here.
We do.
Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll dive into those failed reform attempts.
We'll really dig into what's been tried.
And why it hasn't worked.
And why it's so difficult to actually change things. We'll be right back after the break.
So we're back, and we're still trying to understand why China's economy isn't firing on all cylinders.
Right, we were talking about all those reform attempts.
And how they kind of fell flat.
Yeah, they tried a lot of different things.
Like converting SOEs into limited liability companies.
Thinking that would make them more efficient.
Mergers, too, right?
Oh, yeah. Hoping that bigger would be better.
And they even tried bringing in private capital.
A little outside influence.
But none of it seems to have really worked.
Not as much as they hoped, that's for sure.
So the question is, why?
Why haven't these reforms been successful?
Is it just a matter of finding the right approach?
Well, Lardy argues that there are some pretty major roadblocks to meaningful reform.
Okay, like what? What's standing in their way?
Well, the first one might seem obvious,
Okay.
but it's important to understand how powerful it is.
All right. I'm listening.
It's the fear of slowing growth even further.
Ah, yeah, that makes sense.
The Chinese leadership is so focused on maintaining a certain level of growth.
Even if it's not sustainable in the long run.
Exactly. They're worried that any big changes,
Like downsizing the state sector.
yeah, that could lead to a sharp drop in economic output.
So they're hesitant to rock the boat too much?
They're afraid to mess with the status quo, even if it's not working that well.
But wouldn't a short-term dip be worth it for long-term stability?
You'd think so, but there's another fear that's even deeper.
Deeper than the fear of slowing growth.
Yeah, it's the fear of social instability.
Ah, right. China has a history of unrest when times are tough.
Exactly. And the leadership is concerned that large-scale layoffs
Which would probably happen with any major SOE reform.
could lead to widespread unemployment and potentially unrest.
They remember what happened in the 90s?
Oh yeah, when all those state-owned factories were shut down.
And millions lost their jobs.
It was a turbulent time.
But is that fear still valid today?
I mean, China's economy is much more diverse now. It's a good question.
Yeah, is it really the same situation?
Well, Lardy argues that the potential for mass unemployment and social chaos might be overblown.
Really? Why does he think that?
Well, for one thing, their percentage of urban workers in state-owned companies has shrunk a lot.
It's not as high as it used to be.
No, it's down to about 11% today.
Compared to what?
Over 25% back in the 90s.
Okay, so the impact wouldn't be as widespread.
Right, and those jobs are different now, too.
In what way?
It's not like the old days of lifetime employment in SOEs.
No more iron rice bowl.
Nope, most workers are on contracts now.
So they're more adaptable to changes.
More mobile, more flexible.
And Lardy also points out that the social safety net is stronger now.
There's better health care, better pensions.
So that would help cushion the blow if people did lose their jobs.
It would make the transition a bit smoother.
Okay, so the fear of social instability might not be as big of a roadblock as some people think.
It's still a factor, but maybe not the biggest one.
So if it's not just the fear of slowing growth or social unrest, what else is holding them back?
Well, there's another big one, and it's one with global implications.
Okay, hit me with it.
It's the fear of financial instability.
Ah, right. China's debt has been growing like crazy.
It's a major concern for everyone, not just China.
And the government knows it needs to rein it in.
But it's tricky. They need to deleverage carefully.
Without spooking investors or triggering a crisis.
It's a tough balancing act.
So they're trying to reform these SOEs, but they're worried about the impact on the financial system.
They're afraid that drastic measure
Like forcing those underperforming SOEs into bankruptcy?
could have a ripple effect, destabilize the whole system.
So they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
In a way, yeah, prioritizing stability even if it means delaying those needed reforms.
Kicking the can down the road.
Right. But there's another factor here, one that's often overlooked.
Okay, what's that?
Vested interests.
The people who benefit from the way things are now.
And stand to lose a lot if things change.
I can imagine.
This includes SOE managers who have a lot of power and perks,
Right.
bureaucrats who control a lot of resources, and local officials whose careers depend on maintaining those high-growth numbers.
Even if it's not sustainable.
Exactly. They're all incentivized to keep things as they are,
It's like a tangled web of interests.
resisting any attempt to untangle things.
Lardy describes how local officials pressure banks to lend to failing SOEs.
Even when it makes no economic sense.
Just to protect jobs and keep that tax revenue flowing. Wow, it's not just economics, it's politics and self-preservation.
Absolutely, these vested interests create a huge obstacle to reform.
So it sounds like we've got a bit of a bleak picture here.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge.
Inefficient SOEs, a government afraid to make big changes.
And a whole network of people protecting the status quo.
Is there any hope for change?
That's the million-dollar question.
And hopefully we'll get some answers in part 3.
Lardy does offer some potential solutions, but they require a shift in thinking.
So stay tuned. We'll dive into those solutions and see if China is ready to embrace a new path. Okay, so we've explored the challenges China faces with these SOEs and the fear surrounding any kind of big change.
A lot of factors at play.
But Lardy doesn't just leave us hanging.
No, he does offer some potential solutions.
Some ways out of this.
Out of this impasse, yeah.
But they're going to require some,
Some pretty big shifts in thinking.
like what? Give us some hope here.
Well, he talks about moving away from state control.
Okay, so less government, more
Market-driven approach.
So unleashing the power of those private firms.
The ones that have been doing so well.
Outperforming those SOEs.
Right. Consistently.
But how do you actually do that? What would that look like?
Well, he suggests starting by making it easier for those private firms to get into the game.
Okay, so reducing those barriers to entry.
Exactly. Right now, so many sectors are dominated by SOEs.
Especially in services, right?
Yeah, like telecommunications, finance.
It's like they've got a monopoly.
It's tough to compete when the government already controls everything.
So level the playing field, let those private companies in.
Let them bring their efficiency and innovation.
But what about the SOEs that just can't keep up?
Well, for those, Lardy suggests something pretty radical.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What is it?
He says China should embrace bankruptcy.
Whoa, bankruptcy. That's a big word.
It might sound harsh.
Especially in China, where they usually just prop those companies up.
Right, but it's actually a really important part of a healthy market.
How so?
Well, it lets those resources get reallocated.
From the failing companies to the successful ones.
Exactly, the ones that are actually productive.
It's kind of like,
Like pruning a tree,
get rid of the dead weight.
so the healthy parts can thrive.
So instead of throwing good money after bad, just let those zombie companies go.
And let someone else take over those assets.
Someone who can actually do something with them.
Yeah. Right, whether it's another company, a private firm, whatever makes sense.
It's a tough approach, but it might be necessary.
Tough love for the economy.
And Lardy doesn't stop there. He also talks about,
Oh yeah, mergers and acquisitions.
so not just letting companies fail.
But also letting them be bought and sold more freely,
Based on what?
based on their potential.
Not on political connections.
Exactly. Let the market decide who controls those resources.
That makes sense, but what about those state-owned banks?
Yes, the ones that keep lending to those struggling SOEs.
Even when it's a bad investment.
Right, that's where financial sector reform comes in.
Okay, what would that involve?
Well, Lardy argues for stricter accounting standards.
To make sure those banks are making good decisions.
Sound decisions, based on financial viability, not politics.
No more favors for the SOEs.
Everyone plays by the same rules,
Hold those banks accountable.
just like any other financial institution.
And lastly, Lardy emphasizes the need for better governance within the SOEs themselves.
Yeah, it's not just about the external environment, it's about the internal culture too.
So what needs to change there?
Well, they need to focus on financial performance.
Not on political goals.
Right, more transparency, more accountability.
It's a pretty big overhaul, but it sounds like it could really make a difference.
It could, but it's going to be tough.
Yeah, can the Chinese leadership really do all of this?
It would require a major shift in thinking.
letting go of some of that control.
Embracing a more hands-off approach.
It's a gamble, but as we've seen, sticking with the current system might be even riskier.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance.
So it's not just about the numbers, it's about politics, society, all these interconnected forces.
It's a complex issue with global implications.
And it's something we need to keep an eye on.
Absolutely, because the choices China makes will affect us all.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive.
Thanks for joining us.
We hope you found it insightful, and we'll see you next time.